we start taking some small arms fire. Contact right, start engaging up top, start engaging. Contact left, start engaging. One guy hitting the back behind us.
One thing I've learned from VR is that it's very easy to fool the brain.
There's remnants of soldiers, enemy soldiers on the ground everywhere, and just very kind of surreal, kind of like I'm not really there.
If you do VR well, they engage in the environment as if it's the real thing. It's evocative of the emotions that environment is designed to provoke or induce.
In order to appreciate the therapy and innovation to help those with PTSD, one must first look at the evolution of how PTSD was diagnosed, recognized, and treated. The two leading psychologists who became interested in the degenerative mental states of soldiers returning from the front line was Charles S. Myers and William McDougall. This next video clip explains their initial thoughts on the matter.
The bursting of a shell had caused an invisibly fine molecular commotion in the soldier's brain. In other words, a physical shock to the nervous system had caused the strange symptoms. From this, he coined the term shell shock.
Although the term stuck around through World War II, the meaning behind it was quickly replaced. Myers was finding cases of individuals who weren't near artillery fire but still had symptoms of shell shock, like this man, for example. This proved that shell shock was not due to physical factors, but rather mental, and gave the notion that men in war could and should control their emotions to avoid the symptoms. Here we see a mute man from his symptoms of shell shock who only reacts to the word bomb. He quickly takes cover under the bed as an instinctive reaction, and later comes out and looks to the ceiling for dropping artillery shells. The next individual to study patients of shell shock was Arthur Hurst. The following video is one that he recorded to show the effects of shell shock cause both physical and mental distress. This video also gave hope to those who were seeking treatment, as the before and after videos of affected individuals always result in being cured of all ailments. It was first believed that hysterical conversion symptoms, meaning mental distress produce physical symptoms, was the cause of the jerking and shaking. Throughout the duration of the war, there were over 200,000 total reported cases of shell shock, and by the end of the war, 15,000 soldiers remained in mental hospitals in the hopes of being cured by the one man out of very few psychologists who had success. Oddly enough, shell shock was the second most devastating result of war behind death. The alarming rates that men were breaking down and leaving the battlefield sparked an interest in more military doctors and psychologists who looked for a cure to return the men back to the battlefield as soon as possible. It is important to note that those admitted for shell shock could not refuse any type of treatment or experiment that wanted to be performed on them due to the fact that they were still under military orders. Although shell shock was being considered a genuine war wound and a condition that should be treated as such, it was not a defendable reason to leave the armed services in court. Refusal of a service or experimental treatment meant that you were disobeying orders, which would constitute as cowardice under Britain's law. The consequence was death by firing squad. Treatment options were of a wide variety and depended on the treating physician's ideas about the disease. The most common in Great Britain was bed rest massages and an all-milk diet. In 1916, talk therapy started to become more popular for treatment. The thought was that a traumatic event was repressed and now lurked in one's consciousness, and that talking about the nightmares and recounting traumatic events would be released, as your emotions and feelings would also be released. Another account was that soldiers would have such a great internal conflict between themselves and the obligation to stay in the fight that they would become physically ill. By the end of the war, towards 1918, Dr. Arthur Hurst began treatment of his patients by exposing them to things that caused the trauma in the first place. This can be compared to intentions of virtual reality therapy as we see it now. He would begin by bringing his patients to a peaceful countryside and let them get adapted to the outside conditions that they suffered in. He would then allow the men to shoot guns in the countryside, associating violence with peace. Once he felt the patient was ready, he would travel with them to the exact same spot where they experienced what traumatized them. Towards the end of the war, all the military doctors who were treating shell shock patients created the report of the War Office Committee of Inquiry into Shell Shock. Based on the table of contents, this document included important things like what shell shock means, the causation of shell shock, how to diagnose and treat an individual, and the difference between shell shock and cowardice. The original diagnosis for shell shock is seen here. Having thus summarized the general trend of the evidence, we proceed to consider in detail the questions of causation, diagnosis, and treatment and prevention. To ensure clearness, we can draw attention to the interpretations that have put them in shell shock for the purposes of our inquiry, including emotional disturbance, and mental disorders. PTSD, by definition, is a disorder that develops in some people who have experienced a shocking, scary, or dangerous event. These accounts right here apply to all of the current diagnosis standards that are formed by physicians today. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD today, one must experience re-experiencing, such as flashback, bad dreams, and frightening thoughts. Another is avoidance symptoms, which include staying away from places that may trigger your thoughts and avoiding thoughts or feelings related to your traumatic event. The third is arousal and reactivity symptoms, which include being startled and feeling on edge. The fourth of which is cognition and mood symptoms, which include trouble remembering key features, distorted feelings, and thoughts of blame and loss. These documents help to shape the understanding about PTSD, which was commonly referred to in the Second World War. Dr. William Sargent pioneered the way for newer treatments and techniques through the use of drugs, as he didn't believe that talk therapy worked. Patients were heavily sedated to break the cycle of exhaustion and anxiety in the hopes that deep sleep would help patients forget their trauma. In order to maintain the stature of those who are being treated, he used insulin capsules to keep them physically sharp to return back to combat. Not knowing that insulin may induce a coma, depending on blood sugar level, there were records of men who would not be able to wake up or even reports of death. A lower dosage of the sedative could also be administered, which was referred to by patients as the truth pill because it made them talk about their experiences nonstop. Here we see a man who's being woken for 1 hour of the day in order to eat. Here's a man who's trying to be awoken from his slumber, even though he's in a deep sedative sleep. This is referring to the man being in too big of an insulin coma. He is now okay, but will be put back to sleep sooner than later. During the Second World War, besides drugs, there were 2 new versions of talk therapy that were applied, the first of which was therapy through painting. The idea behind it was that confronting pain, guilt, or despair through painting would induce the feeling of hope, and that bad emotions would be lost in the brushstrokes. This could be compared to the more extreme talk therapies that included emotional degradation and isolation to help one break themselves from their own mind. It was thought that bringing down the self-esteem of a patient would cause them to defend themselves and their actions, which would cause the realization that they were good people. Some soldiers who experienced isolation did so in cells that were only allowed light for 1 hour of the day. Shock therapy became a common cause in the middle of World War II. It was used on patients who were not physically able to move in order to stimulate the muscles that are necessary for walking. This not only conditioned the muscles to start moving again, but showed the patient that they were not in fact paralyzed and could walk if they wanted to. Due to the treatment of shell shock, a main change to the battlefield was the implementation of exhaustion centers that were a couple miles behind the front lines. In this area, soldiers who identified as mentally exhausted or shell-shocked were able to lay down and sleep or be treated by a medical staff. This not only gave comfort to those who felt like they're going to break down, but also helped transport individuals to local hospitals and decrease how rapidly men would be leaving the battlefield. Now that a basis of the origins of PTSD have been unmasked, it is easier to appreciate the new forms of diagnosis, therapy, and treatments that help our veterans get back on their feet.
So it really opened the door and let me kind of begin my healing process. This is really a leap forward in my progress, and it's really been beneficial. It's a unique way to unlock the things that your mind pushes down because it's in a dark, scary place. And that's the end of the scenario.
Okay, good job.